Good morning and welcome to the 14th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. As usual at this point, can I remind all of those present to switch off mobile phones and Blackberries, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Can I point out also, just to ensure that there's no confusion, that the committee members will be, some committee members will be working from iPads, so we can assure you that's in replacement of paper. We're not playing games with them. We're using it as an aid to our work here in the committee, just to ensure everyone understands that. We now move to agenda item number 1, which is to agree that we take agenda item number 3, the inquiry into teenage pregnancy and private. Can members agree? Thank you. Agenda item number 2, the item now that we move to, is to take evidence on the review of access to new medicines, which was published by the Scottish Government, as you know, last week. And we have Professor Philip Routledge and Professor Charles Swainson with us this morning. Welcome to you both. I think both professors wish to make an opening statement to aid this session. And can I invite Professor Routledge first, please, followed by Professor Swainson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I've very much enjoyed looking carefully at the processes of the Scottish Medicines Consortium. I think I highlighted in my report what are regarded as the characteristics of an ideal appraisal process, and the timeliness, which is very relevant to the speed at which Scotland assesses drugs. The relevance, the in-depth nature and usability of the information. The efficiency of the process, which I looked at carefully and believed to be very efficient, and particularly the independence of that process, which again I was satisfied was very independent. And so my conclusion is that the process that Scotland uses to appraise new drugs is a very good one, and one which Scotland should be proud of. My recommendations relate largely to trying to increase the transparency of the process, so that all those involved in the process and who have an interest in the outcome of that process are able to see the qualities of the process that Scotland uses.
Professor Swainson.
Thank you, Chairman. Overall, I found the systems of the ADTC, the Area Drug and Therapeutics Committees, and the IPTRs to be reasonably sound. But I was struck by the evidence both presented to the committee in written form and during your oral sessions, and from the people I was able to speak to, that, if you like, the quality and the consistency of those arrangements, in my view, left something to be desired. So many of my recommendations are about tightening up and improving on what is there already, and essentially asking for more transparency and public reporting, and in some cases involvement in these important systems. I was also very struck by the original petitions to the committee that started this process, and the particular plight of those patients who suffer from ultra-orphan, that is very rare, diseases, for whom very few medicines have been recommended, even though they might be effective in many instances. And that's why I made an interim recommendation about the establishment of a rare rare diseases medicines fund.
Thank you for that. Nanette Millen for the first question. Richard.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Morning. I have to say I found both reports extremely interesting to read. I was actually on the petitions committee when the very first petition came about cetuximab, and I've kind of been involved with this process right the way through. And I mean, there's no doubt there has been a lot of concern expressed, some perhaps valid and some not. But and I do very much welcome what you said about the SMC, because I don't think anyone here would disagree that the SMC has overall done an excellent job over the past decade in assessing new medicines as they come forward. I particularly welcome the suggestion to make the SMC meet in public session. I think that might clarify a number of the problems. And with regard to the IPTR system, I very much welcome what you've said about the orphan and ultra-orphan diseases and the setting up of an orphan drugs fund. However, beyond that, I mean, many patients, many clinicians who are involved, and the industry as well, have all raised, I think, very real concerns over the access to cancer medicines. And we have the fund now for the rare diseases, which I think is excellent. Do you think there could be any case made for setting up perhaps an IPTR fund so that patients could get access to some of the cancer medicines which are clinically thought to be of significant benefit, although they may not be cost effective because some of them are quite expensive?
Though obviously they're not part of the process of SMC, I have real concerns about identifying any one particular condition over another in relation to making access to medicines. I think rarity of disease is another issue, and some of the indications for cancer are for very rare small groups of individuals. But nevertheless, I think if a patient has severe heart failure, which may be shorten the life considerably, then I think it's only fair that all serious conditions be given the same opportunities as say cancer, which clearly is one of those, but only one.
So can I ask, so would some of the rarer cancers then come under the rarer drugs fund?
By definition, they would fall within an ultra-orphan category or an orphan category, so they would be very much part of that. But I would be loath to single cancer out from other conditions which shorten life or reduce the quality of life significantly.
Yes, thank you. I rather agree with Professor Rutledge. There was no evidence presented to me that demonstrated that drugs for cancer are treated any differently from other drugs in the decision-making by SMC, or indeed in the decision-making by IPTR in the single snapshot of work that's been done. Roughly 2/3 of IPTRs are successful, and the same was true in proportion of drugs for patients with cancer. So I think, again, singling out a particular condition, I think, leads you down a very different road, as presumably many other patients with different conditions would argue the same. And I think one of the whole difficulties in this area is that as soon as you've agreed that a health budget has to be limited, then you begin drawing lines around different parts of that, of which medicines is simply one.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. It was actually raised with us by some of the clinicians involved during evidence taking, that principally because of the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is available to patients in England, that Scottish patients were perhaps losing out, not just because they weren't getting the drug just now, but because new drugs coming on stream after the present state-of-the-art ones will be assessed against the current state-of-the-art ones, so that Scottish patients would not be able to take part in clinical trials of medicines in the future, because we're not currently using the ones that are the present state-of-the-art ones, if you see what I mean. And this was expressed as a significant concern, and also the issue of clinicians because they will not be able to use what they regard as state-of-the-art drugs, are already showing some signs of reluctance to actually coming and working in Scotland if they have an academic interest.
Well, the only evidence that I have around that is from the research end of things, where I inquired from the Chief Scientist's office, and you've seen I've got a small section in my report about that. The picture around clinical trials has changed all over Europe, and we no longer do the same kinds of larger scale trials in Scotland, or indeed England, or much of Western Europe. But the evidence is that the trials being done in Scottish health boards and universities just now is approximately the same over the past 3 years or so, and the value of those studies is approximately the same. So I think the emphasis of research has shifted towards smaller volume, higher value studies, often of proof of concept or very early investigations in these drugs, and then the larger scale work for licensing is done elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that part of the report, I don't know whether you, when you refer to the limited evidence that was available in that with the chief scientist, and indeed the change in nature of what's happening across Europe and how we're in a position to compete with other countries on price and other. I don't know whether you would have a view that that is an area that we do need to look at in terms of how we, ensure the best price and outcomes and qualities in that competitive market, and indeed for the Scottish Government's ambition for life sciences here, I think, was the issue which appeared in evidence but wasn't fully developed. I don't know whether you have a view and whether more work needs to be done to address some of these issues, and indeed more evidence needs to be brought to the table.
Well, I have little direct evidence of the matters that you're speaking of, but my general impression has been that the life sciences industry in Scotland is actually doing very well. I know from the universities that the universities punch above their weight very considerably in terms of UK research funding. Despite representing only about 10% of the population, we attract about 14% of the available funding for biomedical research available in the UK. So that's part of the scene seems very healthy. I have no figures at all that break that down into research that's to do with new medicines. But the issue of pricing, I'm sure, is relevant to the whole question. You've already seen that the patient access schemes, that is a negotiated price agreement for a new medicine, can make the difference between a submission being approved or not approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium very, very properly. And against a background where you have very large companies whose annual results, to me, look pretty good, then the whole question really is about pricing and how you set a price that makes it affordable and in a context of cost effectiveness.
Yeah. I think we've had evidence, and lots of evidence, that this is not something about pricing, but about people who are caught in the middle of that negotiation, Professor Swainson. I think that's why we're here today.
Yes.
Richard Simpson?
Yes, I'll just make a comment on what we've just been discussing. I know you say there are 600 phase 2 trials, and it's moved mainly from phase 3 to phase 2, but phase 3 and phase 4, are also really very important. And the UK as a whole has gone down from 6% to 2% of that. So we are not competitive. It is an issue I think the committee, I will certainly be encouraging the committee to look at recommending we should have a separate review on that area, separate from this report. Can I say that, the 10 recommendations, Professor Rutledge's report, I don't have any problems with, and I think they do take the issues a little bit further, but I'm slightly disappointed that we haven't been a little more radical in terms of the structures, because we have The Scottish Medicines Consortium, which is, I think, highly regarded, the committee's evidence and comments previously in the last Parliament and in this one have shown that. We then have 14, or if you include Golden Jubilee, 15 area drug and therapeutic committees, which sometimes meet as consortia, sometimes meet independently. And Professor Swainson, your report says only 74% of the medicines that are approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium are then agreed for inclusion, either awaiting a protocol or not. Lanarkshire's case, 23 out of 23 in your audit were introduced. In Lothian's case, only 13 were introduced, and indeed one more was okay with a pathway, but the rest were not going to be included. Now, I think the public cannot understand that when the Scottish Medicines Consortium recommends a drug for general use or for restricted use, that it is not then implemented across the whole of Scotland. Now, that I think is understandable for me, at least, as an ex-clinician, if it is a Me Too, what we used to call a Me Too drug. In other words, it's a reformulation, or it's a very minor advance on what was previously there, or it's the introduction of a brand product when there's a generic one that's a lot less expensive. I can understand the Area Drug and Therapeutic Committee saying in those conditions, we feel this is not a sufficient advance for us to pursue it. But where it is a novel medicine, the fact that this is not introduced and the fact that the committees are actually second-guessing the SMC with different restrictions, to me is completely not understandable, and I think the public do not understand it either. I have raised before the issue of Tiger Kelor, which was approved unrestricted by the Scottish Medicines Consortium. The west of Scotland got together and said, we will restrict it to certain conditions. The east of Scotland said, we will also restrict it, but to a different set of conditions, neither of which had any evidence base whatsoever, as far as I know. It was merely a clinical judgment. And sitting as an ex-general practitioner in Stirling, in the middle of Scotland, I would be looking at my heart attack patient and saying, well, you better go to the east because you've got one type of heart attack. You better go to the west. And maybe the north, who haven't even made a decision yet, will come up with a much less restricted, you might have to go north. This is not acceptable. So I just wonder why, between the two reports, we've not got a recommendation that the Scottish Medicines Consortium should actually give very clear guidance on the different drugs that they approve for restricted or unrestricted use, dividing them into those which are a significant advance and will save Scottish lives, as Tiger Kelor did in their submission, which was accepted with the SMC, and then into other drugs which might improve patient safety, and therefore have lower side effects and therefore be a significant advance in that respect. And then a third category which says this is effectively a minor advance in a Me Too which you might wish to consider. And that the ADTCs, whose structure I don't approve of, I think we've far too many of them. I think we only need 3 as in fact operated for Tiger Kelor. That is adequate and sufficient. That given those 3, allowing the locality and the pathways and the rest, should be able to do. The one bit of the system I don't understand that you haven't criticised is the bit which says, I think it's number 4 or 5, that it wasn't introduced because clinicians weren't keen to introduce it. I have to say, as the chairman of what was the first pharmaceutical liaison committee in Scotland, I still have scars on my back from clinicians who adopted that attitude. It is unacceptable that a small group of clinicians in one of our 14 health boards should decide these drugs are not available for their patients if they're a significant advance. So I wonder why you didn't actually make much more radical recommendations with regard to that particular area.
Lots in there, gentlemen, and I'll allow you all the time you need to respond to a number of questions within the opinion there.
Right, well, I'll do my best. Well, thank you very much for that. I didn't make those recommendations that you're suggesting because that wasn't exactly what people told me, but I absolutely understand your difficulty around specialist medicines where there is a deal of clinical uncertainty, and the example of Ticagrelor that you mentioned is exactly that. So the drug was approved, and you're quite right, why shouldn't that be used in a more uniform and effective way for people of Scotland as a whole? And You're entirely right. I've heard the same material that it was used differently in the east of Scotland from the west of Scotland, and a reason for that was because of the enormous clinical uncertainty about who would benefit. It wasn't clear at all whether it was all patients or just some patients, and because it was a completely new drug, my understanding from the clinicians involved was that they wished to try it with groups of patients in an incremental fashion. And so you had a group, as you say, in the east, and the specialists in the west started with different groups of patients. We don't know where they've ended up, of course. I have a great deal of sympathy with your view, and I think that when you have medicines that are brand new like that and of a really quite highly specialist nature that are going to be largely driven by a small number of specialists in Glasgow, Aberdeen, and Dundee and Edinburgh, that we could certainly have a more robust way of dealing with those in a more uniform fashion. And I did point out in the table in my report that we could use existing networks to make some of those decisions rather better. So we have a number of clinical networks that in fact drive and maintain specialist standards across regions in Scotland. We have cardiac networks, we have diabetic, we have cancer networks. And the cancer networks already work in that way. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that could be made to work a lot better for specialist drugs of that nature. But that's not quite the same as all the roles performed by ADTC. And I understand your concern about ADTC. Why do we need 14 or 15 when, for many instances, one would do? ADTC, of course, do a lot more than simply putting or agreeing new medicines from SMC recommendations to go onto a local formulary. They do a lot of work locally with prescribers, both in general practice and in hospitals, to ensure the best use of medicines locally, to ensure the detail of how medicines are used, for example, intravenous medicines or the conversion of medicines that you give by vein and when you should take them orally. Special medicines for the skin, feeding, so there's a whole range of stuff they do locally that people need to agree and understand, and many of which are uniform across Scotland. I haven't looked at all the formularies in detail, but I have looked at some where the health boards work closely together. So, for example, smaller boards like Orkney and Shetland effectively adopt the Grampian formulary. They adapt little bits of it for local use, but they're using essentially the same one. So the total number of formularies in that sense comes down a bit. But the other key aspect of formularies and the limited evidence that's published about them is really around agreement about the use of those medicines in a community of prescribers. And you can achieve that when you have people who know each other, work with each other and so on and get on locally, can agree how you use these particular medicines. That's, I think, very difficult to achieve in any kind of national forum. And the key to that, as I'm sure you will recall, is the general practitioners. The general practitioners prescribe the largest drugs by volume in Scotland. General practitioners are free to prescribe any of the medicines that are licensed in the UK or approved for use. That's around 12,000 of them. They can, in fact, prescribe any drug at all that is licensed. Legally, they can do that, whether or not it's approved by the SMC. But the fact is that general practitioners, because they've worked together so well locally, I think, in the kind of groups that you mentioned, and now with ATTCs, they have a broad understanding of how the effectiveness of drugs works locally and for patients in particular groups. They have a very good understanding of how the budgets work and how the costs are maintained within health boards. And I think a single ADT for Scotland would lose all of that local collaboration and all of that local understanding and most of that local budget control. So I didn't recommend that we should only have one ADTC. But I think for the introduction of specialist medicines, an example you gave, and there are several of those, that it would be a very good idea. It would introduce a small delay, but I think it would be relatively small, and the gain would be that everybody understood how the drug was to be introduced, and patients in Scotland would benefit more uniformly from that.
Professor Luttrell, do you wish to comment?
Only to say that I think Professor Swainson mentioned earlier the importance of transparency, and I also mentioned that, and I think the transparency issue is important in relation to this matter too. I think if SMC have deliberated about a medicine and come to recommendations, those should be taken seriously, and the implementation of that be actively tracked, so that we can be clear if there are reasons why those decisions are made, why they were made, and on what evidence base. But I think it is important to recognise that from my examination of SMC, it is very truly representative of the health boards and the ADTCs, and it was drawn from them, and therefore there is a forum there which does try to represent a view across Scotland, and therefore its recommendations are very important and should be seriously addressed and whenever possible taken up.
I think that's very helpful, and I have to say that Professor Swainson's reply with regard to the other elements of the ADTC I entirely agree with. I think they have a very important local role in interacting with all the prescribers. And of course the whole system is drawn from the prescribing community in Scotland. It is up to the individual prescriber whether or not they use a drug, so there is still that caveat at the end if they feel they wish to be more conservative, and some quite rightly will be. It's one of our medicine's strengths to not adopt novel things too rapidly. It can cause problems. Can I move on, Chair, just briefly to the IPTR? It seems to me that this is the area in which we have probably the greatest problems. And if I can leave aside the ultra-orphan drugs for the moment, because I think they're a separate issue, but the ones where there are conditions that are subsets of significant conditions, I think are a problem. And there's another problem in relation to conditions where we have only got perhaps one clinician dealing with it. The example that was given to us, and the Chair will know this well because it was his constituents who were involved, is PNH, where we have a clinic at Monklands that deals with PNH in Scotland, that we had, I think, 21 patients who might have been eligible for the new drug. 14 were recommended, but not all were given because boards adopted different approaches. Now, when you've got one expert clinician in Scotland who is comfortable with prescribing the new drug, which has in this case not been approved, but nevertheless would appear to produce a significant benefit, and where, as it was the case here, the decision must be made very quickly, because to wait actually is fatal for the individual patient, literally fatal, then having a system in which we have 14 IPTR boards to which that single clinician must then apply is a system that, to me, is totally dysfunctional in respect of that particular area. So again, having 14 IPTRs, I think is a problem. And the recommendations that have been made, which are that the patient must be different from the trial group that led to the license, seems to me to produce a fundamental catch-22 for many conditions, because the clinician must decide what is different about this patient. Not what is socially different, not what life extension might be worthwhile, not what comorbidities are there, because they wouldn't recommend it if the comorbidities were likely to be fatal within the time period. These are not issues. These are issues the individual clinician will look at. But if the individual clinician feels that this is appropriate, then it is something which I don't think we've got right with 14 IPTR committees. Because the fundamental thing is, how do you have an expert on each of those 14 committees for these conditions? It's just not practical. There are either massive delays or whatever. So the same thing I was talking about with novel medicines applies to this group as well, in my view, that we need a different approach for that particular group that would take us forward in a much more transparent, fair, timely way, which are some of the conditions that Professor Rutledge quite rightly has pointed out in his report.
Yes, I agree with much of what you've said there. The limited snapshot we have of IPTRs is that 2/3 or so succeed. So the system, in that sense, works for a number of people. The evidence I had, particularly from Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, was that their IPTR process can be very quick. They have it slickly organised. They can do it by email and electronically, and so you can get a quick decision. And that's probably true in the larger boards where the expertise is immediately available. But I think, again, the question you raise about rarer conditions is a very important one. And one of my recommendations tries to address part of that by asking the National Services Division to maintain a register of approved specialists, so that where you do have a condition where there is only one or limited number of experts in Scotland, there is somebody nominated who's able to provide the information quickly to the clinician who's treating the patient in an individual board. I think given the nature of the interaction between the individual clinician and their patient, and then the people on the IPTR for whom they're seeking support, is essentially local. I still believe that you should have that process locally, but I think it can be, a number of things can be done to improve it. Certainly the issue you address about having specialist support for the doctor who is making the application is an important one, and I think that could be improved very quickly. I think the general process, I've made a number of recommendations about the IPTR system and the process as it works, and having seen some of the best examples and heard from some patients and their representatives about examples of not so good practice, it seems to me that the process can be very considerably improved.
Is it likely?
Yes, I think also, just to add to that, I think if for certain conditions one may not need to go outside of Scotland. Certainly in Wales we do look for specialists in England for particular areas where the condition is so rare that perhaps there is no one in our own country who has the relevant expertise. So I think from that point of view, I think these issues are very much a UK issue.
Bob Doris, followed by Martin MacDonald.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm actually going to touch on some of the matters Dr Simpson was referring to. There's kind of some clarity that I think I need, and I want to specifically refer to your recommendations, because I think a lot of what's taken place so far is general assertions about your reports rather than actually specifically asking you about your recommendations. I think that's one of the reasons that we're here. So one of the recommendations is that when SMC approves a new medicine, that within 30 days a board ADTC should give a statement about what its policy is likely to be in terms of making that available across the health board area, and within 90 days that should be rolled out with complete clarity. I personally thought that was supposed to be the situation already. Is there anything new in that recommendation, or is it just making sure health boards are doing the job they're already supposed to be doing?
I think it's largely about ensuring that they do what the latest CMO letter at the beginning of 2012 asked them to do. The publishing bit, I think, is important, because the audit that I attached to my report conducted by Health Improvement Scotland showed that there was a patchy ability to be able to find this information easily on the board website. The majority of the boards they looked at did. However, people I spoke to, individual patients that I spoke to, had found some difficulty. So I think there is quite a lot of work to be done to make it a lot easier to find. And the central difficulty, I think, is that the SMC publishes its advice, gives a clear recommendation, and its advice is usually accompanied by quite a deal of text explaining why that recommendation has been made. And yet if you try to locally find out how that decision flows down through the health board's decision about whether to include it on the formula or not, it's very difficult to see the two match up. And so this was aimed at trying to get boards to A, make a decision quickly, because the decision has been made by a consortium of ADTC, so that should not be difficult. I appreciate that the process of whether clinicians want something to be on the formulary, about whether there are some particular issues, as Dr. Simpson mentioned, around a new drug need to be sorted out, that those things would introduce a bit of a delay. But at least if the board is able to say, we've looked at this quickly since the SMC published a decision, and now we're going to do X, Y, or Z in the different categories that the Health Improvement Scotland's already agreed on how you handle these recommendations, then I think that improves both the speed and the transparency with which the decision making is reached.
Okay, now I find that helpful. So that recommendation 1 is effectively restating the expectation from the Scottish Government for what should already be happening, but more importantly, that there should also be transparency and openness around how health boards come to that decision. I'm actually more interested in recommendation 2 in relation to when these medicines find themselves on local formulary or not, as the case may be. Now, I'm relaxed about whether they find themselves onto local formulary or not, because that is a local decision to be made, as long as it's open and transparent and they say how they've got to that decision. That's fine. So I'm relaxed about recommendation 2. I think that's important. However, we heard in evidence that if individual clinicians wish to prescribe a medicine that was non-formula, that could be a bureaucratic, a time-consuming and a difficult thing to do. And I think somewhere within our inquiry it got lost that where health boards don't put medicines on the formulary, that individual clinicians can still prescribe it and use it in treatment. However, the ease of doing that could be an issue, whether it was the IT systems, whether it was having particular medicines in stock, whether it was just not used to going through the process that it's needed to be. Did you look at that at all? Because, of course, that's the huge safeguard. It almost becomes, on one level, irrelevant what health boards decide in terms of local formulary. If individual clinicians feel confident they want to prescribe something that is approved by SMC anyway, they can do that. But do these recommendations of this report take into account any of the barriers to prescribing that may exist in those cases?
I recognise what you're saying, but those were not issues that were particularly raised with me, and I do remember it. Part of what you were saying came through in a transcript of the official report of the committee, but then wasn't pursued. So I can't give you a detailed answer on that. The only feedback I have is that applications for non-formulary medicines are handled by all health boards internally, and that's a separate process from the SMC one that we were particularly asked to address. I didn't hear any particular criticisms of that. It may be bureaucratic in some places and not in others, so I have no firm information on that. But I think what I was trying to get at is that if we're trying to see a much clearer line between SMC decisions and what appears on board formularies, then that might avoid people having to ask for an additional step in getting a medicine onto a formulary. And I'd like to see that line of decision making quicker and more transparent than it is now, and published more easily.
Okay, completely agree with that, but that's important just to tease out your evidence that you didn't identify any particular problems with prescribing of non-formulary medications. Okay, can I look at the IPTR process? I had kind of suspected for some time, I think it came up a lot in a lot of the roundtable evidence sessions that we had at committee, and I see it as mentioned in the report. Has there been, for all the right reasons but unfortunate, has there been a misunderstanding by the public over what IPTRs were set up to do? And could you maybe say a little bit about that?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, reading some of the transcripts of your own meetings, there seems to be a view that, well, one view I have heard is that IPTR is simply a back door to get access to medicines not approved by the Scottish Medicines Consortium. But that's not the reality of the situation. It's the IPTR, I think, was a compassionate response to enable doctors and the patients whom they're looking after to access medicines for patients who are genuinely different in some respect from the generality of patients contained in the evidence submitted by the pharmaceutical company to the SMC to gain approval or not. Because not all patients are the same. And the patients who have been studied may be one particular group. They often exclude, trials often exclude particular kinds of patients. And so I think the purpose of the IPTR was reasonably clear to me and to many people, but has not perhaps been well enough explained or discussed publicly so that everybody has a good understanding of it.
Much of the IPTR process still hangs on, and it was previously described as exceptionality, but whether it's the intervention will give a response of a higher quality beyond what your peer group would assume, or the trial group. We can change the terminology however we see fit, but that old terminology of exceptionality, people understand, I think, quite clearly what's meant by that, even if we're no longer particularly using that expression. Now, recommendation 10 says that all doctors considering an IPTR must be able to access consistent, knowledgeable support for their patients. National Services Division, NSD, should establish and maintain a register of approved specialists to support IPTR. One specialist may be sufficient for orphan and ultra-orphan diseases, but more than one specialist may need to be available for more common diseases or variants and on a regional basis. And the model of the cancer networks is an example. Now, does that recommendation point to if any individual patient is trying to get their clinician to prepare a case for an IPTR, then if they want to cite specialist evidence that there will be exceptionality or go above and beyond what you'd expect from your peer group to get, that you should go to that national register? So would that be a kind of, if this recommendation was accepted, would that be a mandatory requirement under the IPTR process that this national list would exist?
I don't know whether it would be mandatory. I guess that's whether the recommendation is accepted or not. But what I was trying to get at was that the specialist knowledge and skills of doctors, of course, varies, and yet they have to look after the patients that come to them. So, example of the cancer networks is that because the cancer specialists are generally working in the other hospitals in outside the specialist board area, if you like, then the knowledge and skills of those doctors is available to all the patients being treated with it for cancer within that regional network. And if you like, that's what in a sense what I was answering to Dr. Simpson. But for many other conditions, the doctor treating somebody outside one of the teaching centres may not have sufficient specialist knowledge or expertise, and in addition may not be submitting an IPTR very often. And that's what I heard, that it's difficult if you're a clinician and you have a patient who is is extremely anxious and concerned about their illness and wants to get the best treatment they can, then this appears quite a daunting prospect. And one of the aspects of it is how can I be sure, or how can I test out that the patient I'm looking after does have some clinical features which are different from the patients that were in the studies submitted to the SMC. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that we could make those specialists more readily available to those doctors who don't have that specialist knowledge and skills, so that everybody gets treated on a level playing field, and if you like, the quality of the IPTR application is as good as it can be.
I suppose that's what I'm trying to tease out, because we're going to be asking the Cabinet Secretary about this as well. If an individual clinician was to submit an IPTR on behalf of a patient and they weren't on that national list of specialists for that condition, under this recommendation they could still do that. However, if they went through another clinician who was on that list, it would give the submission added weighting under consideration. So therefore, I'm trying to tease out whether that means this would happen as of standard to make sure is this to be supportive of individual clinicians, or could it in effect, and I have no opinion either way, we're trying to tease out the recommendations, could it in effect undermine an individual clinician's own opinion simply because their name doesn't appear on that national list? What's the intention of the recommendation from that perspective?
It's to be supportive of clinicians. That's the main intention. Okay,
one final question. Recommendation 12 talks about the Rare Conditions Medicines Fund should focus on access to medicines for ultra-orphan diseases. Access should be supported where the SMC has published not recommended advice after a full submission of the medicine and after a successful IPTR or GPTR has been agreed. That bit about after a successful IPTR has been agreed is what I'd like to focus on, is the suggestion that if an individual has an orphan or an ultra-orphan condition and one individual gets their IPTR accepted, then every other patient with a similar condition would, as a matter of course, without having to go through the IPTR process, would get access to the same drug, or would they have to put in a second and a third and a fourth IPTR? Could you explain to me what recommendation 12 means from that respect?
Yes. An IPTR is by definition an individual, for it's one patient and one doctor. What I discussed slightly earlier in the report was whether you couldn't use a system of a group patient treatment request, so that when you have these patients with an ultra-orphan disease, you've got a relatively small number of patients in Scotland, a relatively small number of doctors looking after them, and perhaps a single specialist, either in Scotland or outside, who is able to provide the detailed specialist support to those patients. So if the medicine for those patients is not recommended by the SMC, then that opens the way for an IPTR type approach because this patient or these patients may be different. And what I'm saying is that we should be able to have a system where those relevant specialists get together on behalf of the group of patients they're looking after, if they share common characteristics, and make a single application, as it were, on behalf of a group of patients, rather than each one having to go through an individual one. But it rather depends on whether the patients have enough in common to enable that to happen.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that as yet, so but let me just say, let's say there were 4 patients with a ultra-orphan condition in Scotland, and this new version of the IPTR system was in place, and all 4 patients, who could be right across Scotland, were identified and were put through via one specialist for the IPTR. They could all, on the one decision, they could all access the medicines they need. However, of course, the nature of it, if that is the situation, is that the situation you're referring to?
Yeah, but as I prefaced it by saying they'd need to share the same clinical features of the condition that enable them to be all different, not necessarily in the same way, but all different from those patients already studied by the SMC, because what we're talking about is a not recommended decision by the SMC. So the patients to access through any kind of IPTR process have to have some features which are different.
Yes, I think that's where this committee started with evidence, where that becomes incredibly difficult to do with ultra-orphan conditions, and what we were wondering is whether this report changes that somewhat in terms of changing where the bar sits, in terms of patients with ultra-orphan conditions getting through that system to get approvals via the IPTR process. So does this recommendation change the current situation for patients with ultra-orphan conditions, if accepted by government?
Well, yes, because the funding has been put in place to enable boards to meet the costs of these, so that's helpful to have the fund there. But it doesn't change the overall system, if you like. We're using the same process for these patients as for other patients. So it isn't a different process from patients with any other condition.
Okay, a little bit more clearer, but not exactly where I think I want to be. I may return to that later, but thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Mark MacDonald? Followed by Bruce Smith.
Thank you, Convener. I suspect my questions will predominantly be for Professor Routledge, but the first of which, I note at recommendation 7, you refer to the need for the SMC to increase patient and public awareness of its role and of the decision-making process. And I think that's something that we would have recognised as a committee during the process, is that the SMC is not perhaps the most user-friendly of processes in terms of those of us in the public the public eye who perhaps will read reports about drugs through the media, and perhaps the SMC is not as effective as it could be in terms of getting its point across. Do you envisage, beyond simply a publicly available annual report, which I know you've mentioned there, some sort of regular update briefing from SMC which could be made available, which would give an indication of what the decisions they were making were and what the reasons which lay behind those decisions were?
Thank you. Yes, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. I think it's not just sufficient to be doing a good job. One has to make sure that everyone knows that, and that includes the public. And so I think regular briefings about the work that's occurring, regular updating of the health boards and the area drug and therapeutics committees are all part of that. The annual report is only one thing which I think is important, because it can be written for the general public and the and health professionals to be informed about the work of SMC. The second part of my recommendation there was that I do believe that SMC is shown by its work with antibiotic stewardship that it has the resources and skills to give broader central encouragement to safe and effective prescribing, other than just through appraisals. And I think it's important to link the appraisal of a medicine and the access to medicine is only one aspect of safe and effective prescribing. There's also the whole range of how those drugs are used safely and effectively. And my view is that with the appropriate resource, SMC has the skills to be able to broaden its remit at a national level.
Okay. One of the things which has been touched on during the inquiry, and it's something that has come up in some of the debates that we've had as well, is the way in which certain drugs can be promoted through the media, often by the companies themselves, and that this is not always balanced against perhaps some of the clinical information that the SMC has available to it, or NICE, for example. And I think one of the more prominent examples of that were the issues around Herceptin when it was first recommended for approval. In advance to its recommendation for approval, there was a quite aggressive media campaign in support of Herceptin when there hadn't actually been any submissions to NICE at the time. Do you see there being issues around that in the current process, in terms of the pressures that can be applied through simply the weight of publicity, and how can that be countered against the clinical approach that needs to be taken? It's
always a problem, and the problem hasn't gone away. But I think one way that Scotland has tried to address the issue is by having good collaboration right from the outset with the pharmaceutical industry. And I think I personally see the access to medicines in any health community as being a partnership between the industry and the health service. And therefore, the closer we work together and collaborate over issues like that to avoid those kind of problems, the better. It does mean that there should be early submission of the medicines at a very early stage to the Scottish Medicines Consortium, because I think it's the gap between the licensing of a medicine and the marketing of a medicine that can be the time in which those problems occur. And therefore, timely process with good horizon scanning, which I believe is good in Scotland, will ensure that that period of uncertainty is reduced. But I think it is a mutual trust between the industry and the health service, both of whom have as their main purpose the need to get clinically effective and cost-effective drugs to patients as soon as possible. So we really share the same role. We just have to work more closely together to avoid those kind of problems.
Yeah, the cost effectiveness point I think maybe leads me quite neatly into the issue around pricing. And that's obviously another issue which has dominated much of the discussion that has taken place. I note from within your report that your examination of the QALY system, that health economists pretty much, well, I think unanimously believe that the QALY is the best approach to take. But obviously there has been criticism around the QALY in that there are certain medicines which, by their very nature, in terms of either the size of the cohort or in terms of the stage of illness at which those medicines would be applied, are never going to achieve a QALY which would allow them to be considered. And that has led to some people looking at value-based pricing as perhaps a different approach. Now, my discussions that I've been having would indicate that at the moment we don't know enough about value-based pricing to know if it will have a significant difference to the number of drugs that are made available versus the QALY. What would you say your investigations have uncovered in that regard?
I think that even if value-based pricing comes into place in 2014, there'll still be a lot of medicines, continue to be a lot of medicines where the present appraisal process is important. And I believe from the feedback I got from health economists and from my reading, the QALY is still the gold standard in that it can be clearly measured in terms of quantity and quality of life. And it can allow you to compare different conditions as well as different medicines. I think what can be misleading is that when you consider the QALY to be the most important or the only criterion on which to base a decision, I think one can get into difficulties. It is a necessary part of health technology appraisal, but if it was the only part, then we wouldn't need the Scottish Medicines Consortium or NICE. Those decisions could be made on a strictly numerical basis. However, all of the issues around social value judgments are the ones, I think, that need to be developed in order to put that QALY into context. You've mentioned some of the situations in which that might occur, such as end of life or in children or in other rare diseases and so on. And I think that's the important issue, is that not a sole reliance on the QALY or any particular QALY threshold, but on other social value judgments which may impact on the decision, particularly with ultra-orphan medicines.
And sort of linking that back to my initial question, do you think that a more open and transparent relationship between public, politicians, press, SMC would help improve the understanding of that? Because I get the feeling that the wider perception out there is that the price is the be-all and end-all in the process, and the other factors don't play a role. Do you think that perhaps the process that you've suggested in Recommendation 7 would help to perhaps break down some of those perceptions?
I believe so, and that's why I made the recommendations 1 and 2 as well, because I think by having a transparent process, any misconceptions about the reasons for a decision can be held open to direct scrutiny. And so any process issues then disappear, and the decisions then will be made on scientific grounds on which perhaps the manufacturer and SMC might disagree, but nevertheless it's on the scientific grounds. And the important thing about having the industry at the table is that they can ensure that that process takes into account all of the issues that they feel to be important, and therefore don't feel that the decision has been made on inadequate grounds or in the absence of some crucial piece of evidence. So I firmly believe that is something that will help in what you and what we all wish to achieve, which is a better understanding of how the decisions are made, and they're made in a transparent way.
And just a couple more questions, if I may, Convener. And in terms of how value-based pricing is likely to work, one of the frustrations the committee has had has been that we don't feel that there's enough information out there at present about what the intention of value-based pricing would be in terms of the difference it would make and how it would operate in practice. Do you share that frustration from the work that you've been doing? Did you find it was difficult to get a hold on that, or do you think that or do you have any idea when that information might be more widely available so that we could perhaps hold up the quality and the value-based pricing systems and compare and contrast the approach that will be taken?
I certainly want to know more about value-based pricing and feel very much in the same position, and therefore I think it's very important that we liaise with those bodies that are going to be involved in order to get clarity on that. So I would support your contention that we do need more information.
And just finally, obviously when it comes to pricing, it's not a one-way street. And what role do you see industry having? I mean, obviously, companies which have invested significant amounts of money in the development of a drug, they will want to see a return on that drug. But if that drug is not going to be approved, then they're not going to see a return on it. And what role do you think the industry has in terms of perhaps looking at the pricing setup that they adopt in order that the drug can be made more affordable and thus more available?
I think they should have a major role and already have, and I think one of the strengths of Scotland and the liaison with industry has been the development of patient access schemes, which in a sense are a form of value-based pricing in that the price is set at a level which makes the drug cost effective, or not as the case may be, but nevertheless it's an attempt to make it cost effective. And therefore I think that we should encourage that dialogue with the industry to ensure that the price is set at a level which ensures that the drug is not only clinically effective, which it may well be, but then has to be cost effective.
Thank you.
Can I get some clarity on the quality adjusted life year in terms of the evidence that we received? There was significant concerns in regards to the limits of that equation in terms of, as if we were only talking about health budgets and prescribing costs, where I thought in our discussions with SMC they took some of this on board, but it hasn't been reflected in the recommendations in terms of the cap, which has been in place for 10 years, arbitrary set, which hasn't changed over that 10 years, and in addition to that, the recognition of the impact and the wider benefits of medicines and drugs on the wider family, the community, the care services are in an earlier stage, etc., etc. So that there's an absence of recognition of that and a recommendation and in the review. I think that certainly I would expect it, and certainly with some of the evidence that we had at the committee, it should have been reflected on.
I hope that in my report I pointed out that although the quality still is the gold standard, and I was unable to find anything that would be an alternative, it has to be taken into context with all of the other issues, and particularly the social value judgments, and that I believe is where there needs to be further exploration. The modifiers, the SMC modifiers, for instance, allow some of that those social value judgments to be addressed, but perhaps that could be looked at further. I think also having a process in public allows those issues to be explored much more closely. It allows the not just the industry, but also patients and patient representatives to be present. And I think it's very important to involve them more closely in the process leading up to the appraisal. And I think their submissions can be extremely valuable in helping the committee to come to a judgment which is not solely based on the quality, but on all of the representations of the stakeholders in the process.
Yeah, but it's just a sense from my perspective, and I think those remarks have been helpful, that we should be looking at a wider sort of assessment. but it doesn't, you know, your explanation doesn't take us to the clarity and the transparency and the clear understanding about what's been evaluated, evaluated in the process. If that's almost like I don't want to misrepresent you, but as an add-on, something that could be looked at, something rather than something that should be looked at. And I also wonder, and I'm clear about the people who'd be on the SMC would look at that in their terms of expertise. Would we need other people on there to help with the evaluation of the impact on the community budget, the public purse, that, you know, the extended public purse, that should be looked at, and there should be clarity there about the whole cost?
Well, I think I don't think that looking at the structures of the committee there are any major shortcomings. I think, but I think the patient and public interest group representatives do have an important role, and their role could be strengthened further. They could I think that strength could be utilised in helping to make the judgment. But I think the ultra-orphan issue, for instance, is one example where clearly the cost per quality would not be one that would meet the threshold that's set by NICE, for instance. But nevertheless, such drugs can be approved because of the societal issues that mean that a committee, a representative committee drawn from the health service, but with representatives from lay groups and also clinicians, can make a judgment in which cost per quality might not reach the normal thresholds, but nevertheless the view is from that committee that this drug should be made available. And I think that illustrates to me that SMC doesn't work just on the cost per quality, but it does take into account much broader issues and tries to represent the patients of Scotland as best it can.
You could understand the perception that's out there, given that there's a negotiation sometimes, many times, unfortunately, in the press about the toing and froing, and then at the point of agreement and authorisation of that medication has been predicated on a reduction of the cost of that medicine to the health service. You could understand why people think that this is about cost.
Absolutely, yes.
You can understand why people think about this as a cost issue when you've got a cap that's been set in that quality for the last 10 years.
Yes. I certainly didn't make any comment about whether the quality was at the right level, because I think, whilst I mentioned the word threshold, there isn't an absolute threshold, and then to the best of my knowledge, there is no cap either. So that a drug may be approved at a quality which is significantly higher than £30,000 per quality adjusted life year. However, obviously, if a drug is priced at a price which makes it less than £20,000 per quality adjusted life year, one would expect it to be approved unless there were very good reasons not to. So it really is a sort of a spectrum against which judgments are made, but judgments are made at a cost per quality significantly above £30,000 in some cases.
Yeah. But I think it comes back to your fundamental recommendation that people have got to understand this process.
I think so, and that's
you've told us something that, in terms of evidence, hasn't been particularly clear in the sessions. But Professor Swainson, do you wish to add anything?
No, I just support Professor Rutledge's view that SMC is the right place to take into account the wider societal and other issues around the use of a drug beyond simply its clinical effectiveness and its cost. It can have ramifications down the line for other services in health and outside. For example, if a drug works in a different way to whatever's gone before, then the wider societal gains may be quite considerable. So I'd welcome that approach, and that certainly helps with the general process of understanding and getting drugs approved for use.
Bruce Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Staying in the area of the social values context, I wonder if Professor Rutledge could perhaps take us through recommendation 6 in relation to Citizens' Council or a Citizens' Jury, and maybe say a little bit more about what you would see as the parameters of that being, and what part of the process is that really trying to influence?
I think comments have been made before that social value judgments are not really owned by the by health professionals, but by society, and therefore it's crucial that society be involved in deciding on how on how it's going to use the limited budget it has to support access to medicines, recognising that if we spend our money on one group of medicines, there may be less for other medicines or other treatments, and therefore there is an opportunity cost with every decision. And so what NICE did was set up a Citizens' Council, try to represent society as a whole, obviously with a limited number of people, and looked specifically at the area of ultra-orphan medicines and made recommendations which, whilst not unanimous, were helpful in deciding about taking an approach to ultra-orphan medicines. But that was important because it had the strength of it being made by individuals who weren't suffering from the disease at the time, were independent in their views, were from a variety of walks of life, and therefore represented what society feels about a particular issue. That a slightly different approach has been taken in Wales, for instance, in looking at areas around medicines in which a group of 12 people were asked to sit and listen to expert advice and then come to a judgment about specific issues around health, and that was what they called a citizens' jury. Those are two ways to involve the general public in helping to inform the decisions we make, because it is their health and it's their taxpayers' money that we're dealing with, and so it's one way of ensuring that there is ownership of the decision-making process.
In terms of how a body like that would consider the issues, would it be for? Do you see that as being a process that would be driven by SMC saying this is an issue of concern and of interest to us within SMC and the wider community that we engage with, and we are going to present you as an external group with the parameters of what you want to think about, or is there a public engagement element of it as well? Of, sure, the people involved in the council or the jury or however it's described are impartial in the sense that they are not directly affected by the issues, but could respond to those groups who are directly affected by the issues, or would you need to have a separation?
I think certainly it would be ideal if there were issues that were directly relevant to medicines access in Scotland. SMC should very much be part of that process, but it could be widened to a much broader representation in Scotland. But the crucial thing is making sure that, as you say, that there is a representative sample of the general public who are involved in this and making advice or giving advice independently.
Do you see this as being something that that should be done on either a one-off or a kind of fairly infrequent basis of when an issue comes up, or obviously there is great public concern about this issue at the moment, and therefore it's a good time to take the temperature, if you like, amongst people more widely about their views on the issue? Or do you actually see it as being something that should be integral to how these decisions are made and should essentially be a standing body that is engaged and has a programme of work?
I certainly think you need to try to see how it works first. As I say, the Citizens' Council, I think, did a very valuable job, and similarly in the citizens' juries came up with very helpful advice. But it may well be that if it was successful and it would be something that could be continued. Clearly there are cost implications to such a process, but I think initially one would want to address it to a particular area, whether it was end of life or whether it was ultra-orphan medicines, for instance.
The other committee member, Bob Doris and Richard Simpson.
Yeah, and one of the recommendations, now let me just go to it, recommendation 4, Professor Routledge, you say the SMC should be able to have a temporary pause in the appraisal process at any stage in order to permit further dialogue with manufacturers on issues that would be likely to be central to the subsequent decision-making process. does that infer that currently, once a manufacturer submits evidence and a price, then it goes through a fairly rigid process from that point onwards, and that this recommendation would change that? Is the current process quite inflexible from that point of view?
I don't think the process is inflexible, but because it's very swift, it tends to be that once the clock has started, it continues. And that may mean, for instance, that there might be more than one submission on for a particular drug for a particular indication. Now, that can cause some confusion if you have several decisions. And therefore, if there is an issue which is, as you say, integral to the decision-making process, I think SMC should feel empowered to be able to, and I'm saying SMC because I think they should decide how the process develops and what timelines there are, should be able to have that opportunity to reflect on that rather than necessarily have to go through the process because it started. And I think this is based partly on my own personal experience, that I think sometimes there are issues that can be dealt with which might mean a pause in the process, but nevertheless the outcome then is a much clearer one, and that's why I made the recommendation.
And there is currently a pause in the process with NICE at the moment. They actually have a review period within that. Can I ask you, would the price that pharmaceutical companies have initially asked in relation to medicines, is that something that could be altered during that pause in the process? In other words, what I'm trying to get towards is, do companies sometimes aim high, get a refusal, and then pitch it a bit lower, so they actually get their drugs approved at a resubmission? In other words, can drugs companies use the process as almost like a bargaining chip? So aim high, get refused, pitch it lower. Would this pause allow those discussions to take place within the one submission process?
I didn't see this as a issue around fixing about agreeing a price. No, I think what is important is that SMC's process is so timely that I think anything that systematically impacted on that would be unhelpful. I guess what I'm trying to get at is the issue when there may be a concern about the model that's been used, about the comparators, and in those circumstances, if it's clear that there can be no clear outcome, then it's important to clarify those issues. But I wouldn't see this, and SMC's role is not to negotiate price of the medicines.
I completely agree with that, and I think they've made that point perfectly clear to ourselves. But obviously, if a resubmission comes at a lower price, then that is a longer process than a process that could pause to allow the drugs companies to take stock of their submission and amend it if necessary. And I guess that this pause would allow that to potentially happen. Can I just ask one final question in relation to that? Are there any examples where the pharmaceutical companies have put a submission into SMC and then fairly quickly afterwards put it into NICE, but the price they've put it into NICE is lower than their submission to SMC?
I'm not aware of any situation, and I have no knowledge of that.
Right, okay. No other questions.
Thank you.
Two quick questions, if I may, Chair. One is on the question of procurement. I think it was Professor Swainson, your report referred to some of the bigger health boards having an advantage in procurement, and that being a factor in their Area Drug and Therapeutic Committee approach. I was slightly surprised at that. I thought we purchased drugs on a Scottish-wide basis.
I didn't go into that in detail. That's just some of the remarks given to me by the directors of pharmacy. So,
do you think that's something we should be asking the government to pursue a little bit, at least, just to examine what's actually happening?
I'm sure improved knowledge about all of that would be helpful.
Yeah. The other question I've got is, I noted that the PAPIG, the Patient Participation Group, stopped being part of the annual report in 2008. which surprised me, particularly in the light of Professor Rutledge, your recommendations, which I welcome, about a greater involvement of the patient groups. And I just wonder, whether, if you know why that had occurred. Do you any?
I didn't
get any comment on that?
didn't know
maybe ask the SMC on that. You were positive about the Horizon planning, but I wonder if either of you as witnesses felt that the board's use of Horizon planning was appropriate. Now, if I can just use as an example, the new drug that is partially replacing warfarin, that took a little while to actually be looked at by different boards, and again in different ways. The Horizon planning clearly was there on that issue. Have you done any work, and did you do any work in looking at how the Horizon planning was playing into the ADTCs and the local use?
I didn't look at that, Dr. Simpson, no. Certainly, what I can say about the Horizon scanning work of Scotland is that it is a beacon in relation to Horizon scanning, and has been extremely valued by other health technology boards, health technology organisations elsewhere. So it is an excellent process. I can't comment on the ADTCs and whether, but it is available, and I would say that it would be extremely helpful.
There are two bits. The bit you've praised, which is, I think, quite rightly a world leader. And the second bit is, what do the boards actually do with it? What is the practical part of the implementation? Is that part of the delay, that they are not getting ready for the budgetary requirements and the maybe refinements in use that you've referred to, Professor Swayson?
Yes, I think the Horizon scanning is very valuable. It gives you at least almost a year's warning about what's going to happen. I didn't look at that specifically in relation to was something in a Horizon scan and how long did it take, but I guess in a relatively in a country of our size, with the relationships we have, you do wonder if we couldn't kind of get all that kind of prepared and accelerated. I think that's partly what I was saying about the ADTC's general response is in that vein.
Thank you. And the two other just quick questions. One is, we've talked about all the new drugs coming in, that's fine. But what about the SMC having a role in saying, actually, these drugs, although they're still licensed, are no longer regarded as being of clinical benefit? In other words, what can we stop using? They may not be hugely expensive drugs, but you take some of them, the add-on cost of the prescription as opposed to the cost of the drug is significant. So I've got two parts to that question. One is, should they be recommending that a medicine should be no longer used in the Scottish context? And the second thing is that, in terms of the fact that we all recognise we have a global package of costs, and we have decided that we should not have prescription charges in Scotland, which has reduced the income to the health service by somewhere between 56 and 70 million pounds, and certainly the original, the previous prescribing charge system was an antiquated and, I think, bankrupt system and needed radical alteration. But nevertheless, we have got rid of that money. Is it something that you think we should be considering, a sort of Oregon-type approach of saying, or an approach that's indeed used by other countries, of saying there are some medicines that actually shouldn't be on prescription? That may go slightly beyond your remit, but I'd just be interested to know whether, in terms of the budgetary consideration that we've got, whether we should move to a situation where some of the drugs, particularly those with the add-on cost of actually issuing a prescription, as opposed to saying to the patient, go and get it, is sometimes 2, 3, and 4, or even 8 times the cost of buying it over the counter. So I'm referring mainly to OTC medicines.
It certainly wasn't part of the review of the SMC process. I think you're making a very important point about the need to look at acceptable disinvestment in some of the things we do in the health service. And so I was hinting at that in my recommendation that SMC could help in the broader context of looking at general medicines management, clearly that's part of the work of the Area Drug and Therapeutics Committee, but sometimes central coordination of some of those or materials which, resources which help to move the use of medicines, particular medicines perhaps that are being overprescribed in certain circumstances towards, particularly if there's variability across Scotland. All those things, the skills of the people in SMC are appropriate to helping in appropriate disinvestment in treatments of limited value or potentially harmful in some cases. So I think it's important to try to link together the assessment of medicines with all the other medicines use, not necessarily all the provenance of SMC alone, but I think SMC could take a much broader role given the appropriate resource.
Yes, I would support that general view. I think the way in which we no longer use medicines is a process that happens sometime later. And we've got some very good examples in Scotland of how that's come about. So, for example, some drugs used for treating rheumatoid arthritis are monitored very closely at the ADTC level to ensure that only patients who really require those drugs get them, and the safety monitoring that has to be done is done to a high standard. And we've had a great example in recent years of the changes in the use of antimicrobial drugs, where for quite different safety reasons we've agreed that certain drugs may be effective, but the side effects in terms of promoting an environment that encourages Clostridium difficile was no longer kind of acceptable. So we changed antimicrobial prescribing and effectively no longer use certain drugs in Scotland either at all or in very much reduced amounts.
I have two final very quick questions. One is, do you think it should be a requirement to publish all trial data when submissions are being made? That's a very topical issue. The BMA, which I should declare a membership of, is having a campaign on this at the moment, mainly related to Tamiflu, but also related to other drugs. I mean, should it be a requirement, if we're going to recommend a drug is used, that we should insist that the pharmaceutical industries all sign up as part of their submission to making available all trial data?
I'd have to declare an interest as well as being president of the British Pharmacological Society, which is signed up to the All Trials campaign, and I firmly believe that all clinical trial data should be made available. I think it's important. Again, it comes down to the issue of transparency, and I'm delighted to see many pharmaceutical companies signing up to that.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
I think, Chair, I've taken up the committee's time more. I have
well,
some more
you prompted another
right
couple of questions. I've got Bob and Nanette for a couple of quick questions.
Well, this one will be a brief question, I hope. Mr MacDonald was talking about value-based pricing and obviously the cost-effectiveness and social benefit of drugs and the lack of information at a UK level. Of course, value-based pricing has a Scottish context, and that's recognised within these reports as well. Something this committee will also be looking at shortly is the integration of health and social care. And in my many discussions with pharmaceutical companies who have not been backward at coming forward and speaking to committee members in relation to their views of what the SMC process should look like, I can assure you. But one of the things I always ask them is, in terms of their pricing strategy, do they ever have conversations about, well, this drug, this medicine will benefit not just the NHS but social care providers, so local authorities in 2 years and 5 years and 7 years, and there seems to be a real dearth of economic modelling work done by pharmaceutical companies or anyone else in relation to being able to give an evidence base to that benefit. Now, the reason I ask that in the context of value-based pricing is that if those economic models can be built, you could release money from the system to provide drugs and medications that otherwise would seem not to be affordable. But in the context of value-based pricing, is this something that could be affordable if Scotland thought imaginatively within this process? And would you have any comments to make on that? Because this committee will be looking at health and social care integration as part of our other work.
I think that's a fascinating question, and in some senses represents a real opportunity if we are going to integrate health and social care and think of them as whole systems, which is how people have to think of them and deal with them. Then the ability to take into account the effect downstream of using a medicine at a particular time in a person's life on subsequent health and social care costs later must be important. My only experience of that is with some of the ultra orphan diseases, particularly those that affect children and which can result in profound disability later. If you're able to prevent all of that, part of that, with a course of treatment early in the child's life, then I would have thought that any economic model should be able to take those things into consideration.
Just for clarity, neither NICE nor SMC currently during their approval process, when they look at cost effectiveness, will look at savings to local authorities or other public sector bodies should a drug be approved. That's not looked at just now and it's not quantified just now, is that correct?
That's my understanding too.
Should value-based pricing, the problem is we don't actually know what value-based pricing is going to involve. In your opinion, would it be deficient if it didn't address this issue where what the savings can be to local authorities and other public bodies? If it did it in a merely health economic model, would that be a weakness within value-based pricing, do you think?
Clearly, if the model of health and social care is an integrated one, then the issue has to be addressed in order to see the true value of the true benefits. But that would suppose that had actually happened, and obviously that's not the case at present.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nanette Miller.
Yes, a brief question as well, and it's not actually, I confess, part of your current remit, but it was prompted by the references to disinvestment. Do you think there's a case to be made for sort of like processes and procedures within the NHS to be scrutinised and evaluated in the same way as medicines, which doesn't appear to happen at this point in time?
Certainly, I think medicines have led the way in terms of an evidence-based approach and also an economic approach, because the price of a medicine is quite clear and benefits can often be measured much more straightforwardly. But I think the principle is also true that that the same principles can apply to other forms of care and should much more in the health service. And I think medicines have led the way in showing just how valuable that, I suppose, more objective approach can be to assessing all treatments. And I think we should be assessing the value of treatments, not the cost of the treatments in isolation, but the value of the treatments and invest in those that give us give patients the best outcomes.
Thank you for that, because I think, particularly with the increasing demands on the NHS, I think it's going to become increasingly important that we know what value we are getting out of the entire service. Thank you.
There's no further questions, I've no further bids. Can I thank you both, gentlemen, for your sharing your work with and your recommendations this morning, and sometimes going beyond those as well. Thank you both very much. Thank you. We suspend this session until we signed round the witnesses. Thanks. We now continue to item 2 on our agenda and welcome our second panel this morning. Alex Neil, Cabinet Secretary of Health and Wellbeing, Professor Bill Scott, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, and Dr Aileen Keel, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary, please, to make an opening statement before we move to questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener, and many thanks for the opportunity to appear in front of the committee this morning. As you know, I've listened to the concerns raised through the petitions and recognise the need to have an independent review to identify what improvements were needed to the whole issue of licensing and availability of new medicines. Medicines are obviously an essential part of clinical care for patients, and NHS boards are responsible for making sure clinical care is optimised through the most effective and efficient use of the most appropriate and cost-effective medicines. However, there are around 12,930 UK marketing authorisations, licences, for prescription-only medicines in existence. Clinicians are key to optimising the care for their patients, which involves critical decisions around the use of medicines and other therapeutic interventions. At heart, this is about therapeutic relationship between the clinician and their patient and the care that the NHS provides for families in difficult circumstances. The Scottish Medicines Consortium has a challenging job to appraise newly licensed medicines and to provide advice to NHS boards in Scotland about their clinical and cost effectiveness. Its process involves the use of SMC expert clinicians to provide guidance on the place of the medicine under consideration in the best therapeutic care for patients, which may involve comments on best practice clinical guidelines. The SMC will consider the views alongside the other available evidence. The SMC has published advice on 854 medicines indications to date. Of these, 595, 70%, have been accepted or accepted for restricted use within the National Health Service in Scotland. Those who gave evidence to the committee recognise the value of the work that the SMC does. I believe we have a national system to be proud of. At this point, I'd like to just quote some speakers who presented at the recently held 10th anniversary conference of the Scottish Medicines Consortium. Professor Lloyd Sansom, Special Advisor, Department of Health and Ageing in Australia, said, "I extend my congratulations to the SMC on its 10th anniversary. In that 10 years, the SMC has developed into one of the most respected health technology agencies in the world. In Australia, which has a much longer history of HTA, the evaluations from the SMC are widely read and are considered to be one of the benchmarks for assessments." Similarly, Dr. Mary Baker, MBE, President of the European Brain Council, said the SMC punches well above its weight and has become a powerful influence in Europe. And I could quote many other experienced experts in this field making similar comments. Obviously, difficult decisions have to be made around the value different groups place on relative cures versus very short life extension, possibly 2 to 3 months, where quality of life is uncertain. SMC decisions to publish not recommended advice about medicines reflects that the evidence that the manufacturers submitted to them about benefits of the medicine do not justify its cost. Whilst many pharmaceutical companies have engaged in the national process to offer discounts on their medicines, others have chosen not to do so. And this has to be viewed within the context that medicines prices have escalated very significantly in the last 20 years. The SMC has been able to publish advice to confirm its acceptance of some 25 medicines on the basis of a patient access scheme since this scheme was established in 2009, and I would like to see us build on the success of this scheme. A group of more than 100 world experts in chronic myeloid leukemia recently published an article in the Blood Journal arguing for the need to lower prices of cancer medicines to allow more patients to be offered them and to maintain long-term healthcare policies. And the committee may wish to consider this aspect in their deliberations. I certainly agree with the clinicians. I would like the political parties to work together, ideally, to to find a pragmatic approach to facilitate a shared understanding and support on the need to ensure the best possible outcomes for patients and the clinicians in this challenging environment, whilst meeting our responsibilities to patients and the public to achieve this within the resources allocated to the National Health Service. And in terms specifically of how we move forward, Convener, we will not take any decisions on the Swainson or Routledge reports until we have seen and considered the report and recommendations from this committee. We will then engage in a period of public consultation with the objective of trying to get cross-party agreement and consensus on the way forward in dealing with this difficult issue. If we can take it out of party politics, I think that would be to everybody's benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I have the first question from Mark MacDonald?
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for coming along today. In my previous line of questioning to the professors, well, specifically to Professor Routledge, I mentioned the committee has concerns around a lack of information on value-based pricing, what it entails, what difference it will make, and how it will be distinct from the QALY system. And without wishing to place words in Professor Routledge's mouth, I think it was clear that he also has similar concerns around where there is a lack of information around value-based pricing. Can I ask if you, Cabinet Secretary, also share those concerns, and what you've done in terms of discussions with the UK government? Has there been a lack of information coming forward about value-based pricing?
Can I first of all just emphasise that the pricing of pharmaceuticals is still a reserved matter, and it's not one that we have legislative responsibility for. And therefore, in the context of value-based pricing, or indeed any other aspects of pricing of medicines, decisions and the leadership on this issue has to come from the Department of Health in London. Now, the Department of Health has said that it is happy to consider these issues and discuss them with the devolved administrations in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. I have to say, when it comes to value-based pricing, we were expecting to be much further down the road in terms of the preparations for the introduction of value-based pricing, which originally was due to be introduced in January 2014. And certainly from the very limited information that we have on the status of the value-based pricing proposals, it looks at the moment as though January 2014 would be an extremely ambitious, if not already almost unachievable objective for the introduction of value-based pricing. Let me say, though, that we are very much in favour of the principle of value-based pricing, in particular in terms of taking in a range of additional factors into consideration of the pricing of medicines. But I think also we need the cooperation proactively of the pharmaceutical companies. And I think they have to be much more open about how they price their products. I mean, I heard a question being put earlier this morning to Professors Routledge and Swainson about whether there is any evidence that the pharmaceutical companies use the SMC effectively as a dry run for the presentation to NICE. And if they do that, is there a difference in the price? Well, the honest answer is we do not know, because they're very secretive about their pricing. Now, I can understand the commercial interest in being secretive up to a point, but nevertheless, I think much more openness all round in this whole area would be helpful for everybody. But in terms of value-based pricing, absolutely we are supportive in principle. As I say, it's a reserved matter being led on by the Department of Health, and we're very disappointed at the lack of progress.
Okay. On the point about the role of the industry, because that was a point which I also explored with Professor Routledge, was obviously the issue of pricing is one that cuts both ways, and industry, while they will have spent large amounts of money developing pharmaceuticals, they will obviously want to be in a position to get them to be purchased. And do you detect in the discussions you have that there is a willingness there for perhaps a different approach to be taken around, not just around the pricing, but also the approach that is taken in terms of submissions, and perhaps more flexibility in the future might be something we would be able to see?
I think flexibility is very important, and I'm very supportive of as much openness as possible. Now, I do recognise, having worked in the commercial world myself for many years before coming into the Parliament, that obviously each company is operating in a very competitive and very commercial environment. But I think within that, there are certain areas where the companies could be more forthcoming, particularly about the cost structure, about the development costs of medicines. Now, clearly the core argument by the pharmaceutical companies is that very often it can take 10 to 15, maybe more years before, in developing a particular medicine, it comes to market, and therefore they've got to make up for the costs that they've incurred during that period. And similarly, particularly with new medicines, sometimes they're not on the market all that long before they're superseded by another drug. So I recognise the challenges that pharmaceutical companies have in terms of, at the end of the day, they are in business to make a profit. But I do think it would be in their interests, as well as our interests, and most importantly, the interests of patients, if they were a bit more forthcoming and a bit more open with us in terms particularly of pricing and the cost structure, because while we recognise that they have to turn a pound or two on pharmaceuticals, nevertheless, if you look at the profits they're making, a lot of them are making very, very substantial profits indeed. And one wonders if we are getting the best bang for the buck.
Okay, and lastly, just in terms of the process, and I note that there are recommendations from Professor Routledge around the transparency of the process and trying to improve public awareness, public perception around what the SMC approvals process actually entails. Do you believe that a more open process in terms of being publicly accessible, but also in terms of the decisions that are taken being made more publicly available and perhaps more user-friendly for those of us who are not perhaps well versed in the terminologies, would be of benefit in because I get the feeling that there is still a shroud of mystery that hangs over some of the decisions that are taken, and often that then leads to misconception about what it is that has led to a particular decision on a particular drug being taken, and perhaps removing some of that shroud of mystery might help to improve public perception.
Can I begin by saying I think in this debate there's been a couple of misconceptions probably in the public mind. First of all, I think there's a misconception that the SMC turns down more drugs than it actually approves. As I've already said, the SMC approves for use or restricted use 70% of the applications it receives. And therefore, by definition, that's a very large percentage of approvals. The second area, in terms of IPTRs, again, I think there's a public perception, reinforced, I have to say, sometimes by consultants wrongly advising patients that it's a waste of their time to apply for an IPTR. And I've certainly had anecdotal evidence of that. Nearly 2/3 of IPTRs, including IPTRs for cancer drugs, are actually approved. So, again, there are far more approvals than there are rejections, and I think that's very important to get that message across. And I think one of the advantages of far greater openness in the SMC process, and indeed right across the board, including, as I said, with the pharmaceutical companies, one of the big advantages of much more transparency would be a far greater understanding of just how much better this system is than some people recognise or think that it is. Now, that's not to say that the process itself requires further refinement and improvement, and, absolutely, and that's why we're going to listen very carefully to what the committee's recommendations are and what your view is on the Routledge and Swainson recommendations before we make a final decision. But my principle, not just in relation to drugs, but right across government, has always been to maximise the transparency and the openness, because I think that gets everybody a much better understanding of the complexity, particularly in an issue like this, the complexity of the issues that have to be faced up to. It would also, I think, allow people to see just how much information the SMC is or isn't getting from the applicant for a new drug. Because sometimes the the information is initially turned down, not because they've reached a conclusion that it's not the right drug, it's because they haven't had the evidence to show that it's the right drug, or there's an issue around other aspects in terms of other drugs available or whatever. So the more openness there is, the better understanding there will be. These are difficult decisions. They're very, very difficult decisions. They're not unique to Scotland or the United Kingdom. This is a global issue about the availability of drugs at the right price, in the right place, for the right type of patient. And clearly, I think we should be as open as we possibly can be, while, of course, always maintaining patient confidentiality.
Thanks. Can you? I know it's part of this whole process and what the pricing, but you do agree that the UK should be leading on establishing a value-based pricing model, do you?
Well, there's two interpretations to that question, Duncan. Can I say, under the current constitutional arrangements, it's absolutely the right thing to do. Obviously, if we had different constitutional arrangements, I think we would still very much cooperate with the rest of the UK, but perhaps on a more equal basis, and perhaps in that basis we would be driving it far faster than is appearing to be the case at the moment.
I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary. It just amazes me how we get to this situation, but I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary explaining how we would be more able to take on the big pharma from purely a Scottish basis. But the second follow-up question I was really going to ask before you introduced the Constitution, Cabinet Secretary, which I'm very surprised you do, was while you While you have said that you suggest that if a different constitution would be leading this process yourself, you see the delay, have you suggested a different approach to the UK government to address this issue?
Well, actually, we are very much kind of in the dark as to exactly what is happening. And the Department of Health, I think, perhaps I don't know if they've got more information than they're giving us, but certainly we don't have a great deal of information on what is actually happening, other than the very clear indications that the chances of this being introduced on the original timescale is getting less and less likely. And the other thing in all of this is, of course, the Cancer Fund down south was established on the understanding that value-based pricing would be coming in early in 2014. Now, we've already seen in recent weeks a substantial reduction in the number of medicines made available under the Cancer Drugs Fund in England. And I would think it would be in the interest of the Department of Health, if nothing else, to decide the future of the Cancer Drugs Fund if we were further down the road in value-based pricing. I'm not blaming the Department of Health. I'm just saying it's very, very unclear at the moment. And it's disappointing because I think we're all agreed right across the UK that value-based pricing is the right thing to do.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Can we move on now to Aileen MacLeod and then Richard Simpson?
Thanks very much, Convener. I can also just say to the Cabinet Secretary that I welcome you awaiting the recommendations from the Health Committee in terms of the review itself before making a final decision in terms of recommendations, and also the fact that there will be a consultation, a brief consultation over the summer. So it just really was to get some clarification around the actual timing in terms of when you see the recommendations coming into play, because obviously there are concerns about the introduction of value-based pricing, that it's becoming less likely that this will not happen on the deadline that's set for the 1st of January 2014, and obviously we've also got the new Cancer Drugs Fund coming in to replace the current system.
Well, in terms of where we go from here, I mean, obviously I would anticipate the committee's report, I presume, will be published with recommendations before the summer recess. And once we get the committee's report, then we will have a period of about a month when we will consult key stakeholders, both on the committee's report recommendations as well as the Swainson and Routledge report. We will then form a view on how we think we should move forward, but simultaneously I also at that stage would like, and I've made it clear to opposition spokespeople. I'm very keen that we sit down with opposition spokespeople and see if we can agree on the way forward in quite a detailed way, because I don't think, convener, it's in anybody's interest for us to have to revisit this issue in another year or 2 years' time. I think if we can get a robust system up and running that we're all signed up to, I think that would make much more sense. And any system, of course, would need to be robust enough to cater for the introduction of value-based pricing. I think the processes we're talking about are precisely that, more processes than particular pricing strategies. But the process has to be robust enough to deal with any radical changes in the pricing strategy.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary, because obviously we need to make sure we've got as much kind of confidence and trust as possible behind, the new system to make sure that we can take that forward.
Richard Simpson.
Can I join with my colleague Aileen MacLeod in welcoming the approach that the Cabinet Secretary is taking on this? I think that it is in all our interests to get this right this time. This is the second time we've had a go at this issue. The first one resulted in the IPTR instead of exceptional needs, and that clearly, has worked to some extent, but not worked to another extent. But there are areas, I think, where we perhaps, maybe shouldn't be waiting for reports and consultation, and that's in the area which is already really made quite clear by the CELs and CMO letters, and that is in the operation of the Area Drug and Therapeutic Committees, in terms of, first of all, their timely publication of results. Now, in the last iteration of this issue, we got the 90-day rule came in, and we've had that out there, and we found from the audit it isn't always being obeyed, and it isn't then being published adequately. So my first question is, will the Cabinet Secretary, rather than waiting for the full report, actually take action on that issue now? I know the instruction has been reissued to the Area Drug and Therapeutic Committees, but can he indicate what he's doing to actually make sure that bit is implemented?
Absolutely. Well, as Richard Simpson rightly says, we have reiterated and reminded the local committees, that drug and therapeutic committees, that there is a 90-day period and that they should adhere to the 90-day period. It's there for very, very good reasons. And we are talking to individual boards, including chief executives, to make sure that that really happens much more timorously than it always has in the past. And clearly, if any board doesn't adhere to that, then we'll look at what we need to do to make sure that they do. But I'm very much of the view that that 90-day period should be adhered to as far as possible. I'm going to ask Bill, as the man in charge, to add anything to that he wishes.
Thank you, Minister. His have now set up an audit process to take forward, looking at how boards are performing, so that we can give feedback to boards and reach that target of 90 days.
And that's very good. The other bit of this is, of course, the variation. When a drug is recommended for full use or restricted use by the Scottish Medicines Consortium, the audit, which was very helpful in the reports that we've had, showed a variation between Lanarkshire, which had 23 out of 23 drugs were put onto their formulary, and Lothian, which only had 13. Now, the report suggested that one of the reasons for clinicians, which was not wanting it on their formulary, one of the main reasons was it wasn't applicable in this area. They didn't have the specialist element. That's not borne out by the fact that Lothian is one of the areas that had the lowest input, and used the excuse of clinicians not wanting it. So I just wonder if, again, without waiting for the report, apart from continuing the audit, which I assume from Professor Scott's answer will apply to that as well as to the timely publication, that we actually get much clearer reasoning as to why the medicine is not being accepted quickly and appropriately and timely. Only 74% of medicines recommended by the SMC, which is itself 70% of the applications, actually get through to the patient. So you're talking about a fraction of a fraction, still a majority, but still a fraction of a fraction. So I wonder if you're prepared to take some steps now without waiting to ensure that first of all, the reasons are made clear, they're not accepting. Secondly, saying that if it's not applicable in that formulary, which was Professor Swainson, Dr. Swainson's suggestion, that actually is laid out as a seventh reason separately. In other words, it's not needed on our formulary because it'll be dealt with as at a tertiary level.
Can I just correct your maths? Because 70% of 70% is 49%, which isn't a majority.
Well, I think it was 74%. We can quibble.
But the point you make generally, Richard, is absolutely, I mean, we're at one on this very clearly. The last thing we want is any kind of postcode lottery in relation to the availability of these very important drugs. When you analyse the 26% in Lothian's case that wasn't made immediately available, certainly within that 90-day time period, there are some, there's a range of reasons as to why that was the case. One of the reasons is sometimes that the clinicians themselves say that they are not keen to offer this because something else is available that they think is still superior. Now, I'm not going to overrule clinicians, and I don't want clinicians to be in a position where they feel as though they're going to be overruled because of a rule that doesn't allow them the degree they need as clinicians to make a proper clinical decision. But, you know, in terms particularly of the new drugs, the brand new drugs that are coming in, I don't think there's any excuse for the delay myself, and it will be part of the audit that is undertaking because we want to see a much more consistent performance in this area.
And just come back very briefly, I think the conservatism of the profession is one of the patient's safety guarantees. So I'm not advocating that everybody adopts every medicine just overnight, but of course the prescriber doesn't have to prescribe it. It's the fact that it's banned on a formulary on the area of the whole of Lothians, and they include the borders because they work on the same formulary, that tranche is excluded, whereas just alongside it in Lanarkshire, just over the border, you know, they can get all 23s.
Absolutely. And what we need to do is we need to get consistency across the country so that at any one point in time we've got a consistent approach across the country. And I think that's very clear, particularly in Professor Swainson's report. Now, there are issues around how you achieve that consistency. There is obviously a case for saying that once the SMC takes the decision, then we implement this nationally rather than having 14 boards implement it at different paces. I certainly don't think it's a case for abolishing the the Area Drug and Therapeutic Committees because, as you heard in evidence this morning, they do a fantastic job in a whole range of areas, and to lose that locality connection would be, I think, a huge mistake. So we ain't going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but nevertheless, in terms of the temperature of the bathwater, I think we need to raise it a wee bit to make sure that everybody, everywhere, we're being consistent, we're being timious, and we're doing what is really required, which is to make these drugs available consistently throughout the country.
Particularly for the novel drugs, which are the ones. Yeah. Thank you.
Have we got no other questions to the Cabinet Secretary? Gil.
Thanks very much. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. There's a lot of discussions around the IPTR, and in Professor Swainson's recommendation 9, he's suggesting that consideration should be given to a member of the public being on that panel. I'm just wondering if that's something that you're attracted to, if you could say something on that.
Yeah, I think both in the IPTR process and the recommendation from Professor Routledge about a Citizens' Council jury, I think these are very welcome recommendations. I don't want to preempt our discussions or the committee's recommendations, but certainly these are things that we would be more than happy to support. I do think it's right. The public needs to be much more involved and seem to be more involved and feel as though they're more involved in these decisions. And actually, I think that will lead to a far greater understanding both ways. It will lead to a greater understanding by the public of the complexities of some of these decisions. But it'll also lead, I hope, the clinicians to better understand the public perception about some of these decisions. And let's try and close that gap, because I think there is an element of this is about misconception. And we need to do that. And I think, Gil, that's a welcome recommendation.
Well, I mean, there is an issue, I think, with regards to the public's expectations and knowledge about how the process works. And you know, so, but one member on the panel may not provide the transparency that's required and ways to inform the public. Have you any ideas of how you would, over and above that, inform the public
well, can I
how
say,
it would operate?
Can I say there's a big difference between the public having access to the decision-making process of the SMC and an IPTR? By definition, an IPTR is about an individual patient, and there's issues about patient confidentiality. And therefore, we have to be much more careful about what arrangements we have for having non-clinicians involved in an IPTR process. So it may well be that we adopt a kind, and I'm not, you know, I'm talking here about the principle rather than whether it should be one or two or whatever. But for example, we, I think, successfully have run a system of public partners in Healthcare Improvement Scotland's inspections, for example. And that system of public partners, on which there are certain obligations on the public partners in terms of how they go about their business, that may be the kind of model on which to build this kind of participation. But that's exactly the kind of issue I'd like to see what the committee's recommendations are, and then to discuss it with the other parties. But I draw very clearly the distinction. I think it's going to be, it's when you're talking about a decision about the availability of a drug where there's no patient, particular patient interest involved, I think that can be much more open than a discussion about an individual patient's requirements, and that's where I'm slightly more cautious in that. I think the principle's a good one, but we need to be absolutely sure that it in no way compromised patient confidentiality.
Understand that fully. I was talking more about not the individual case, but the overall work of the panel. And one of the areas that I think that we were informed earlier on, one of the benefits that we would get would be the impact on a person, and you know, and so rather than in their wider life and their families, so that giving the public the opportunity to engage, or a member of the public to engage in that, may be beneficial, but that element of it, the decisions taken, but not on the individual, but the overall panel work, be publicised to inform. I think there is a lot of misconception exactly how the process works at the present time, and I think there is a bit of noise around that it doesn't work in some cases, when in fact the evidence would say otherwise.
Yeah, and I think there's also, as I say, you know, I've certainly had anecdotal evidence of some consultants telling patients, "Oh, it's no worth your while applying to the IPTR." Well, that is a misconception. It is worth your while applying to the IPTR, and it's worthwhile taking some time, both the clinician and the patient, to make sure that it's a good quality application they put in. Because very clearly the whole purpose of the IPTR is to assist patients who feel as though they need access to a drug that's not generally prescribed. But in terms of the wider involvement, I think with the IPTR process, I think the more people understand about it, then the better. And how we go about that, I think, is wide open for discussion. You know, we're certainly not. We're going to consult very widely in that, because there's a lot of implications in terms of the recommendation.
Annette Millen.
Thank you, Convener. It's really recommendations 9 and 10 on Professor Rochester's report about a register of IPTR decisions being kept centrally, I presume, so that we know what's going on in different parts of the country, and there's a regular sharing of experiences between the different drug and therapeutic committees. Have your comments on those recommendations, please?
Well, I mean, it seems to me a very sensible recommendation, and certainly fits with the other recommendations made by Professor Swainson. Again, you know, we will wait and see what the committee says, and we'll discuss it with the opposition parties, but it seems to me that it's the type of recommendation I would think that would be broadly welcomed, because it's a sensible thing to do, and it also helps us gather intelligence. It would also help us identify in future where if there's any part of the country the process doesn't appear to be working as well as it could and should do. So in some senses, the more information you gather about what's happening out there, the easier it is for us to monitor the situation to make sure the system is working as robustly as it could and should be.
Thank you. So I was hoping you'd say. Thank you.
Doris.
Thanks, Convener. Just a brief comment before my question, Cabinet Secretary. You said that some clinicians may say to patients it's not worth applying as part of the IPTR process. I would hope that was a poorly expressed view from clinicians in terms of informing patients the clarity for what IPTRs are actually for, because of course some patients shouldn't go through the IPTR process raising false expectations if clinicians know that they, at face value, fairly evidently wouldn't meet the criteria of the IPTR. So I think that's important to say, because one of the things that the report teases out is a lack of understanding from some members of the public, quite understandably, about precisely what IPTRs are for. And I just kind of wanted to kind of put that on the record. I would like to look again at the area drug and therapeutic committees and the length of time that it takes for drugs to go on the formulary. Another misunderstanding has been that even if drugs don't go on the formulary, they can still be prescribed by clinicians locally, and I think that's something that has to be made clear as well. I did ask this question in the previous evidence session. Do you have any views on whether the ease of access for clinicians who wish to prescribe and use drugs that are not on formula, whether there's any barriers to doing that locally? Is there a way we could make that easier? And asking that question, I would rather we had the formulary right to begin with, but individual clinicians should be allowed to make independent decisions based on their own knowledge, expertise and views.
I'm going to bring Aileen and Bill in to answer part of that in terms of what their view is, and particularly the latter point. But I think underlining your question, Bob, is that we've got to be much clearer, all of us, SMC, the boards, the government, much clearer both to clinicians and patients exactly what can be done at each stage of the process and what cannot be done. And one of the things I would like to see, for example, for patients is a kind of what I would call a taxi driver's guide to how you kind of use the IPTR process if you feel as though that you're not getting a drug that you think is essential. Because very clearly, patients, this is a very complex area, and I think if we have an easy guide to make sure that patients know what their rights are and know what the chances are, without unduly building up expectations that are not realised, because obviously there's a wide degree of discretion in terms of the final IPTR decision. A whole range of factors are taken into account, and the patient might not totally appreciate that unless we explain it properly. So I think in terms of getting the message across to both clinicians and to patients, there's more work to be done to make sure that everybody has a full and proper and comprehensive understanding of the IPTR process. But I'm going to ask Aileen and Bill to come in, particularly on your latter point about how it's working on the ground.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think the response to the question he posed to Professor Swainson was that he had no evidence that there were those kind of barriers in place. You're absolutely right. Any doctor can prescribe any medicine that's licensed. I think that the main thread for me running through these two reports is the need for greater transparency, more openness around the processes so that we demystify it all. If there is evidence, and I think we need to look for it, that clinicians who want to prescribe licensed products that are not on a local formulary are having undue barriers put in their process, then we'll address that as part of the information gathering around this.
Bill?
Thank you. As Dr. Simpson pointed out, medicines, all new medicines are not necessarily all the best medicines you have. And it was interesting to look at Professor Swainson's report, where he said specialists should be brought in to help get some uniformity in formularies. Therefore, there are a number of medicines, and depending which literature you look at, could be 80% which are me too. But they may have difference in their side effect profile, but not in the formulary. Where a clinician wants to use that medicine and it has gone through SMC, then I believe there should be a very simple process for the clinician to get that medicine for their patient. And as Dr. Keogh said, we will look at that.
Can I just stress, by the way, the importance of the local formulary, because clearly, since that was introduced, it's allowed us to manage the prescription. I mean, this year we will spend £1.4 billion on prescription drugs. About £1 billion of that in the primary care sector and the rest elsewhere, primarily in the acute sector. That's about 15% of our entire budget. And the local formulary is part of making sure that we manage that as effectively as possible. So while we want maximum flexibility and we want to remove any unnecessary and artificial barriers, at the same time, again, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the local formulary is a key tool to managing the prescription budget.
It was stated that a number of health boards almost pull their approach to local formularies, and I think Dr. Simpson was given some examples of that. So ADTCs, there's 14 committees. They do other jobs, other important functions other than the local formulary. But could there be an approach from government to standardise some of that joint working? So rather than allowing health boards to feel their way in terms of when they cooperate or otherwise with other health boards, could we standardise and formalise some of that, do you think?
I think that's definitely an area for us to look at. We need to obviously consult, particularly with the clinicians and the boards, but also with other stakeholders. And again, I would be interested to see what the committee recommends in respect and answer to that question.
And another recommendation within the reports is a national register of experts, where local clinicians feel they may not have the detailed expertise in terms of demonstrating the evidence base for their individual patients for the use of the IPTR process. Is that something you're initially supportive of? I mean, my gut instinct is it's an excellent idea as long as it's in a way to be supportive of local clinicians, rather than, and I don't suggest it would do, but you wouldn't want a local clinician to think, well, I am an expert in this area, my name's not on that list, but I feel as if I have to go to someone that's on that national list. So some potential dangers with that, but by and large, an attempt to support local clinicians?
Absolutely, and I think we want to stress that point. It's there as a support mechanism, not as a substitution mechanism. Because the relationship between the clinician and his or her patient is extremely important, and particularly, in the type of diseases or conditions which are more rare, not necessarily rare in the sense that very few people have them, but more rare, where you might only have a handful of specialists within Scotland, for example. I think it makes absolute sense to put their advice at the disposal of the clinician dealing with the patient. But it still is the clinician's patient. And I don't think the specialist would want to usurp the role of the clinician.
That's helpful. Final question. It was the one I asked at the end of the last evidence session in relation to value-based pricing. So it's not in terms of the speed of it being rolled out or the lack of clarity, or nothing to do with that, but in terms of the Scottish context, where we are moving to health and social care integration, and we're very much looking at pooled budgets, single budgets, and early intervention, keeping people at home and healthy for longer, and where a pharmaceutical intervention, where a medicine can make that happen. There are financial savings to local authorities if someone is more mobile and more healthy, needs less support at home. But my understanding is nowhere in the UK is any of this taken into account in the modelling work for the cost effectiveness of medicines. Do you think we should get to a stage, whether it's Scotland or where is the UK, let's put the constitutional arguments all to one side, just in terms of what's best for our constituents, Cabinet Secretary, when we look to approve a drug for certain use, should we be looking at the not just the on costs of prescribing that drug, but actually the downstream savings to local authorities, to social care costs? Because that's not my understanding something we're doing just now. Is that where you would see this going in future years?
I think the more robust we can model, the better. I mean, to give you an example, it costs on average £4,500 a week to keep someone in an acute hospital in Scotland. It costs on average £1,800 a week to keep them in a community hospital setting. It costs between £500 and £600 a week to keep them in a nursing home, and it costs about £300 a week to keep them at home. Now, if by taking a new medicine or a new drug, somebody is kept out of acute hospital, even for a week, that saves £4,500. If they're at home, the net savings £4,200. If they're in a community hospital instead, you still get a net saving of £700 a week. So by any standard, these are very, very substantial savings, especially if it's applied, across a large cohort of patients. So I think it makes absolute sense that we try and have robust modelling and evaluation systems that can take these factors into account. Now, it may well be that it's very difficult to do it at a patient level, and you have to do it at a more generic level. But either way, we do need to develop more robust evaluation models as part of this process. I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
Thank you.
I think Drew Smith.
Thank you, Convener. A brief question, then I'll maybe come back to something else. But clearly, if all these recommendations were to be pursued, and understand that we're not agreeing that today, then there will be implications in terms of the amount of drugs that are prescribed in Scotland, and therefore implications for the budget, whether it was up or down, and we can come back to that, because I fully appreciate that we're not at that stage yet. But in terms of the recommendations that have been presented, because I appreciate your offer to listen to what the committee has to say before coming to a final judgment on all of this, but I presume that the government have made a very initial assessment of that there is nothing in these recommendations that presents a challenge to you in terms of resources available for more reporting, holding things in public, setting up citizen juries. There is nothing in there that is of concern to you.
I mean, the recommendations are not costly recommendations to implement, quite frankly. And therefore cost is not going to be the issue here. It's about, is it the right thing to do? The key measurement must always be, does it improve patient outcomes? Does it improve the satisfaction in the patient journey? And that's what this is about. At the end of the day, we must never lose sight of the fact that we're trying to create a patient-centred, a person-centred health and social care system in Scotland. And therefore the key issue here is, does this improve patient outcomes and the patient journey? And if the answer is yes, and I think, for example, transparency, improving the process, making it simpler, informing people, and all these things, citizens' juries and all that, I think that does help us to improve certainly the patient journey in terms of understanding, and hopefully by improving the patient journey, improving the patient outcome.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think that's helpful for the committee to know that as we consider these. The final question I had, I suppose, is on the broader point. When we've taken evidence on this before, a number of people have made the point that medicine spend is probably the most scrutinised part of this process. Do you have a view as to whether or not other parts of, if you like, the picture around treatment for patients should be subject to a much more rigorous process about what value really means?
I mean, I think you have to look at the totality of health provision. I mean, prescriptions are a very important part. Drugs are a very important part of it. It takes 15% of the entire £12 billion a year budget. But there are many other parts of the health service. For example, tomorrow we're going to be having a debate around, for example, bed numbers. Now, it's not just the crude issue of bed numbers, it's the balance between, say, surgical beds and medical beds. That's all part and parcel of how well people are treated, how well they're treated at accident emergency. Last week I spoke at the conference for dementia champions, and the graduation award for the first dementia champions. Now, the improvements that have been brought about to the care of dementia patients, particularly in the acute sector, but also in the primary sector, as a result of the work done by the dementia nurse consultants, paid for by the Alzheimer's Society in Scotland, has been absolutely first class. So, you know, I think we've always got to look at the totality of every aspect of the system and be constantly scrutinising it to make sure that we're getting the answers right. The other thing in the health service, and you know, I've been just over 7 months in this job, but the goalposts are moving all the time. As new medicines come forward and are able to do things that, I remember the days when a cataract operation in one eye required hospitalisation for weeks. Now you get it in a morning and you're back out. So clearly you don't need all those beds you needed 20, 30 years ago when a cataract operation was you had to be in hospital for weeks at a time. So it's changing all the time, and we've got to make sure that we all change with it and change fast enough so that we always stay ahead of the game and try to make sure that the best treatment that anyone can get anywhere is available for people in Scotland. That's our objective.
How will these proposals? I mean, I think there are aspects to all of this that, as you say, are very, very complex. But for the people who have petitioned this to Parliament and the emails that we've been getting from Janice Glasswell, the relatives of Janice Glasswell, I'm sure you've had them as well, and their quest and her quest to get Tuximab, the cancer drug, that's freely available and on prescription in England. It's not available here in Scotland. How does this review change that situation? We had this week, yesterday I think, a consultant here in Edinburgh claiming that there were 40 such drugs that were available in England but not here, and that there were people accessing their relatives in England to get access to cancer saving. But how does this review help people in that situation?
First of all, I actually met Janet Glasswell and her husband, and I think all of us in that situation would feel exactly as they do. But as a politician, I'm not in a position, I don't think anybody would want me to overrule clinical decisions. I think if we get into that situation, it would be an extremely regressive state of affairs. Can I also say that one of the misconceptions is that, again, this is all one-way traffic, that there are drugs available in England that are not available in Scotland. There are many drugs available in Scotland that are not available in England. It works both ways. And therefore, we have to make sure that the SMC process, the IPTR process, and all the infrastructure around it is as robust as possible to make sure that where it makes sense, makes clinical sense for somebody to get access to a particular drug, they get access to that particular drug. Now, the key issue here is defining what makes sense. Very clearly, for example, with the issue of children with cystic fibrosis earlier this year, there's estimated to be just over 50 children in Scotland with a particular Celtic mutation, which meant that they would benefit substantially from the Kalydeco drug. That drug, it is claimed, will extend their lifespan by up to 16 years. Now, clearly that's a very expensive drug. It's a very rare condition, and it's a rare drug in that sense, because in Scotland alone it's just dealing with over 50 people. So it made sense, in my view, to make that available. I mean, hopefully we will have a cure for cystic fibrosis within 16 years. But obviously each drug, each case has to be decided on the merits. I think by making the system more transparent and by making it more consistent and by making it more robust, we hopefully will end up with better informed decisions, better understood decisions, more robust decisions, so that people who would benefit from a particular drug do receive it within, you know, the parameters of what we can do.
Do you accept that the individual patient treatment requests that were introduced not so long ago have caused some confusion, and that the way that was presented, that was presented as a solution to getting access to drugs, which hasn't come about?
I think the system itself, the underlying system, was the right thing to do, but very clearly, by definition, you wouldn't be having this investigation. I wouldn't have had my review from both Professor Routledge and Professor Swainson had the system been working as well as we had hoped. And very clearly, their recommendations and the committee's recommendations will be designed to improve the working of the system. But the fact that over 2/3 of IPTRs are approved, I think is an indication that it's working far better than is, I think, sometimes perceived. Having said that, there are improvements to be made, and I hope we can reach agreement on what those improvements are and then implement them as quickly as possible. But it is, I mean, every country in the world is dealing with the issue of availability of medicines at different levels. You know, very clearly, as people live longer, as demands in the National Health Service grow, as resources become tighter because of the budget squeezes we've had in recent years, as the complexity of comorbidities increase, as the incidence of comorbidity increases, and as both the cost but also the potential benefit of new drugs are dramatically improving all the time. Clearly, this is about the allocation of resources. It's about priorities. It's about where do you set the parameters. And it's not an easy question, and anyone who pretends that it is isn't being honest. This is not an easy issue to deal with, because literally you're dealing with matters of life and death.
So do you agree then that with the SMC's contention there should be a wider debate and opinion polling on this to agree the priorities, or should the priorities simply be agreed by politicians or clinicians?
Well, I think it has to be driven by the evidence, basically the evidence primarily about the impact of the drug, but also the evidence in terms of, you know, the cost of the drug and whether that's the best use of resources, because obviously every time you spend money on one drug, there's less money available for other drugs, and it may well be that more people would benefit from the other drug than drug A. So I don't think you can take a decision just by opinion polls on these things. That has to be based on hard evidence, and that's why ultimately I think it has to be primarily driven by clinicians rather than by politicians or opinion polls.
Back to Drew Smith's, you know, he alluded to this question, that why should that sort of scrutiny in terms of outcome, value, that quality, if you like, not be applied to all services? And I see Bill Scott nodding at that, but why does the Cabinet agree, that the Cabinet Secretary agree that it should be applied then to all services that we provide in the NHS in Scotland?
Well, in actual fact, there's many different processes in the National Health Service, but they're all fundamentally about trying to allocate resources based on clinical priority. So I think my answer basically to Drew was that's really already happening, and decisions about resource allocation are all, this is about resource allocation, and resource allocation is a very difficult thing to do. Let me give you an example. We spent last year about £45 million on research directly in the National Health Service. One of the benefits of that research, the results of it over the last couple of years, has been a very dramatic reduction in the incidence of C. diff. Another benefit of that research, the informatics science, has been a substantial reduction in amputations, particularly for patients with diabetes. Now, we invested that money on that research, and it has paid off. It might not have done, you know, it was a risk. But very clearly, these are the kind of decisions that have to be taken, and absolutely they should be scrutinised on a regular basis, because it's about the most fundamental of decision making. It's about the allocation of scarce resources within the National Health Service.
At that strategic level, but are you claiming that the rigorous assessment of how of drugs and new medicines is common to every service is delivered in the health service?
Well, we try and apply rigorous assessment. I mean, obviously, a number of boards from time to time, for example, convener, undertake a review of clinical services in their area and the configuration of those services. As you know, some years ago, I was involved in opposing the proposals arising from the review of accident and emergency services at Monklands and Ayr Hospital. And the result of that was a very, very rigorous review led by Professor Andrew Walker from Glasgow University. Now, that's going on day in and day out in the health service. We rigorously review all of these things, and I'm happy to ask Aileen to give you more detail on that.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. This is the bread and butter of what NHS boards do day in, day out. I suppose that the reason we're around this table is because what we're talking about here is a very discreet, high profile in terms of media coverage, high cost area of new drug developments, which have really come on board over the past few years, particularly in relation to cancer drugs. Many of the drugs that we're talking about are monoclonal antibodies, which began to be developed maybe 10 years ago, and now we've got a whole swathe of these drugs coming online, being licensed, but made available to the NHS only at very high cost. So I guess that explains the focus of this committee and the two reports on this area, rather than other more routine areas of NHS delivery, which, as I say, the boards scrutinise day in, daily.
Richard Simpson.
Just a very brief question or comment. The Killadeco issue. I don't quite understand why the SMC didn't actually make that decision, because we are going to be faced as we go forward with situations where there are drugs being produced which are quite clearly for specific subgroups within a disease area, that they will have. I mean, we are at the beginning of an era of personalised medicine, and we are just at the beginning of that. But unless we face up to that and recognise it in the structures that we put in place, we're going to have a real problem, are we not? Because we're going to have to make the sort of one-off decision you made on Killadeco is going to be replicated. And then what's the threshold level for that? So the bowel cancer drug that was turned down by the Scottish SMC, subsequently they found that with a genetic marker, something like it would be beneficial to 70% of those with bowel cancer, which is a very big number. It still made it very, very expensive, but nevertheless it narrowed it down to a special subgroup. So just wonder what your views from the politics of this are, that how do we, we've got, if we start making decisions on individual drugs, are we not in a very difficult situation unless we hand that off to the SMC?
Well, I mean, my view is that we want a system that doesn't involve politicians making decisions about what drugs are available and not available. I think that would be a huge mistake, and I think we would end up in a very bad place if we ended up as these being political decisions, and that's why I'm very, very keen to try to get agreement across the parties on what system we go forward with, because I think if we're all signed up to it, then I think we can agree to take day-to-day politics out of this whole question about the availability of particular drugs. I think Richard poses a very, very valid question. I mean, one of the more exciting developments we have going on in life sciences in Scotland at the moment is going to be the new Stratified Medicine Innovation Centre on the campus of Glasgow Southern General Hospital. And I think that will help Scotland become a world leader in stratified medicine. But stratified medicine, by definition, raises a whole host of the kinds of issues that Richard touched on in his question, and I do think there are bigger issues that we will need to tackle in terms of the whole question of when we get much more personalised medicine. We're now in a position, or will be in the next 5 years or so, where the genetic mutation of a particular cancer that an individual has will be diagnosed. Not just the type of cancer, but actually the genetic mutation of that particular tumour. And that will require then, presumably, for treatment, very, very individualised treatment. So there are huge questions there about how we then decide, how do we resource that? How do we make sure the cost is there and all the rest of it? So this isn't the end of this debate. This is, in a sense, the beginning of a whole new debate about how we tackle these big, broader issues. I think in terms of this piece of work, I think it's about trying to get a robust process in place that we can move forward with. But I absolutely agree there are big, big issues that still need to be addressed on, a strategic level.
I think, Chair, one of the fundamentals we are very much agreed on is that unlike England, which only looks at medicines referred by the Minister, whereas we have a situation where SMC look at everything, and that's one of the fundamental differences, which leads me on to a final question or comment, is, if maybe you'd like to comment on, I understand there are a number of countries across the world that follow the SMC lead and actually adopt what the SMC has suggested in terms of approving medicines. And I wonder if we've done any research to find out which these countries are, and that we might in the future invite them, because we can't stop them using our very good world-leading decisions, but invite them maybe to contribute to the costs of a system that may have to be more robust and therefore go into more detail.
We should maybe franchise it out and raise some
money.
That's... Can I just say, that's our understanding as well, but it's been pretty anecdotal. But I'll be happy to ask officials to see if they can do some research just to inform the committee about what happens. Clearly, I quoted Australia, and very clearly Australia, I wouldn't say it copies the SMC decisions, but clearly, as they say, the SMC decisions do inform their decisions. I should make the general point, of course, in the last 6 years, that anything this government does is widely copied across the world.
I think I'd extend that to 13 years, so Cabinet Secretary, just to end on a more consensual note than you.
Right. No other questions for the Cabinet Secretary? Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues for being with us today and the evidence provided. We look forward to working with them on this issue over coming weeks and months. Thank you. We previously agreed in our early session that we would go into private session to discuss teenage pregnancy. I'm suggesting that we defer that private session to next week. Can I have the committee's agreement? Thank you very much. Thank you all for being with us this morning.